Thank you for joining us. My name's Ian Stroud.
And my name is David Malone. And this is Hyperland. Well, on today's edition, we are really pleased to be able to welcome Chris Blackhurst. He's an award-winning business writer. He was the former editor of The Independent. 10 years he was city editor of the Evening Standard, and before that he worked at the Sunday Times on their insight investigations, amongst other things. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
We're talking to you this morning about your new book, Too Big to Jail, which I have to say is a fantastic book, because the story of HSBC and its money laundering, I genuinely thought I knew a lot about that. And then I read your book and realized I didn't know anything about it. It's the rabbit. Did you realize how deep that rabbit hole went when you started, or was it a surprise to you?
I think it was a mixture. I knew it went deep, but you're quite right. I didn't realize it went that deep. And I think the more you get into it, and the more brazen the drug cartel was, and I didn't realize the extent of that. The Cayman Islands was really quite horrific. And then the political interference at the end to stop them, the Americans would I didn't appreciate before just how keen the Americans were to bring prosecutions.
Well, that's interesting, because that's the one bit I was aware of, but everything up to that point, I had no idea that the rabbit hole.
Well, it's one of those. It's a funny. I was city editor at the time of the Evening Standard, and I was aware of the story, but it's one of those curious things sometimes happens in the media where a big story breaks, and for all sorts of reasons, and it just doesn't take off. And I think one of the telling things about this particular story is that even when it was all done and dusted, and they'd agreed, they'd agreed a fine with the Americans of $1.8 billion, the record fine, and they agreed as well that they would go into some sort of rehab reform program. But when it was all done and dusted, that was it. There's nothing happened here in the UK, and yet HSBC is Britain's biggest bank by far, and there was no inquiry. Nothing happened in the House of Commons. All the different regulators couldn't care less. Nobody actually lost their job.
That was Osborne and the FCA at that time, wasn't it, Chris?
Yeah. So what happened, for the benefit of your listeners, is that the Americans wanted to prosecute. They got tons of evidence that HSBC, through a mixture of negligence and, in some offices, particularly at the Mexico end, some corruption, they wanted to prosecute. They wanted to prosecute the bank. And part of the irony of this is one of the reasons the Americans wanted to bring a prosecution was that they were very aware and very sensitive to the allegation that no bank was prosecuted over 2008.
Right.
So they really wanted to throw the book at HSBC, and they were all ready to do that. I mean, they effectively, they really were ready to do it, the Department of Justice. And right at the last minute, there was this intervention from George Osborne, who was then the Chancellor,
Right, yeah.
effectively saying, if you prosecute HSBC, first of all, he tried to play the foreign card, saying you're only doing this because because it's a foreign bank.
Yeah.
Well, that was nonsense. I mean, absolute nonsense. That was thrown out. And then the second claim, the one that stuck, was if you prosecute HSBC bankers, you threaten to bring down the bank, and you threaten to bring down the entire banking system. And that was eventually believed by the Americans. And the irony of that is that was the very same argument that was used in 2008.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't that what Hank Paulson said?
If anything, a more egregious example. I mean, we're talking about money laundering here. We're talking about money laundering of billions and billions of dollars. We're not talking about, some mortgage lending that had gone wrong. This was pretty awful stuff. And the same argument was used. So you have to ask, at what point, if ever, are we ever going to prosecute bankers?
Yeah. I've got something more in common with a chap that you might know, Curtis Warren. He was a friend's brother was sort of linked with him, and then there's a book called Cocky. He was involved with the Cali cartel, and had dealings with someone called Mario Halley, who was described as the European sales manager, which just goes to show that these cartels, that they're large businesses, really. And he was accused of money laundering in 1991, was jailed for 6 years. Another chap, Usama al-Kurd, he got 14 years and £1 million fine.
Well, I mean, as we speak, El Chapo, who ran the Sinaloa cartel, he's in effectively solitary confinement for the rest of his life, plus 30 years. Don't ask me how that works. And not just him. I mean, his associates have all been taken down, a lot of them.
Yeah.
The other point you make is quite right, is that, and I think this was something, you asked, did I appreciate the depth of it before? One thing I hadn't appreciated until I really started looking into Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel was the sheer level of organization. And we are all made to think that the drug bosses are bloodthirsty monsters who literally just go around killing people and doing horrible things. Well, they do that. There's a bit of that, but that isn't their main business. Their main business is, if you step back from it from a second and treat drugs as a commodity, it is literally growing, cultivating, harvesting, transporting, packaging, selling, finding market. I mean, he was running a massive, almost effectively a multinational corporation.
Yeah, and that was my point, Chris. That although if you take the drugs out of it and that illegality, they are money laundering, and these guys are getting 14 years for it. So why is a society that we, because of the connection with the drugs, will prosecute them, but it's exactly the same as what the banks are doing.
Well, I say in the book that the war on drugs was declared by Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I think 1982 from memory. The war on drugs then is just about the longest war we've ever had. Yeah. It's had no impact at all. Drugs are still as rampant as they ever were. Even the Sinaloa cartel is still the biggest cartel in the world in Mexico. They're now using Chinese banks to launder money, and challenger banks and all that stuff. So, the war on drugs hasn't worked. And the problem here, and this is in the book, that it's much easier for a cop in the States or even in Britain, wherever it is, to take down a dealer.
Yeah.
You see somebody on a street corner, they're clearly doing something dodgy, search them, you find some drugs, you've got an arrest.
Yeah.
And you're going to get a conviction. And it is much easier to do that than try and trace complicated financial transactions. And the reason they're complicated is that, of course, we have a whole industry that exists to help people hide their money.
Yes.
And these are professionals. I mean, we take this sort of thing for granted, but we casually chuck out phrases like secretive offshore tax haven or something. We don't really know what that means.
Yeah.
What it means is incredibly sophisticated professional advisors whose job it is to hide people's money and their wealth. And that's the industry the poor old cops are up against.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I the phrase, it was never actually used in Watergate. Everyone thought it was. It was in the movie, but not the book. But the phrase "follow the money."
Yeah.
And we don't. And so what happens is the street dealers get caught. And in America, 3 times caught, 3 strikes and you're out. You get a very heavy sentence. I think it can be life in some states,
Yeah.
California, and but they're replaced. They're easily replaced because it's easy money. I mean, okay, you take the risk, but the guys at the top, who and then we say to us, we don't ask ourselves, well, how come they've got Ferraris? How come Chapo had 5 mansions, 2 zoos, a little train that went round the zoo? Because the thing that really turned him on was big cats. And so he had literally a collection of panthers and pumas and jaguars and tigers. And, how do you buy this sort of stuff?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? That the front end of the drug business is cash, because I don't know anyone who buys their cocaine with their Visa card. You've got to hand over cash. So the idea they're going to phase out cash, I've always thought, well, that's going to make a lot of junkies very, very unhappy. The whole of the Isle of Dogs will have a collective nervous breakdown thing. But then you can't buy all the things you just listed with cash. You can't walk into a Ferrari dealership. Well, maybe you can.
No,
but you certainly can't rent a plane or with a trunk full of slightly greasy $10 bills.
No, that really is the point. Particularly, we never really stop to think what's going on here. And basically, you're quite right. You sell drugs on the street. It doesn't matter who you sell it to. You're not going to get something that's traceable. So you'll get cash back. The cash is inevitably a filthy, crumpled dollar bill. Now, if you're dealing at Chapo's level, we are talking about billions of these things.
Well, that's right. Let's give just a hint of the scale, because from your book, it came out to be 16.1 billion in cash between 2004 and 2008. I mean, that's lorry loads. You'd have to have a train to shift all
lorry
of that.
Loads. That's the point. And they were the number 1 narcotics supplier for the United States and Canada. They were selling anything anybody wanted, but from marijuana to coke to heroin to
they got into crystal meth as well, didn't they? That's another part.
They had laboratories, and he treated it, and this is in the book. I mean, one of the ironies here, I think I make the point, is that HSBC took a decision they weren't content with being the best bank in the world, and they were voted the best run bank in the world. They actually took a conscious decision. They wanted to be the biggest bank in the world.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to be the biggest bank in the world, you've got to be everywhere. And the biggest banks in the world are Bank of America and Citigroup. And you have to have branches and a network that covers the whole globe. You can't just be big in Asia, which is what HSBC was, and the UK. That's not good enough, not big enough. So they set out to be the biggest bank in the world. They buy this bank in Mexico, which no one's ever heard of. Meanwhile, Chapo, for all his lack of, I mean, the juxtaposition, of course, is that HSBC is run by a guy who was at Oxford, McKinsey, all those things.
We're talking about Lord Green.
Yeah, Chapo is barely educated. I mean, he didn't really go to school, can barely read and write. But he has similar ambition to build the biggest drugs organization in the world. And
And then they helped each other.
They two come together and they help each other. Now, the end result of that is, as you rightly point out, that Chapo is left with billions of dollars in cash. And you cannot walk into a bank and, I mean, you know, it's shown sometimes in mob films, people walking into banks with holdalls full of cash.
Yeah.
Well, you try it. You can't do it. You can't do it in America. You know, alarm bells go off. It will not happen. So his solution was to smuggle the money, the cash, back down the same routes as he was using to bring the drugs into the States. So, and we're talking about, he had 13 aircraft, he had submarines, he had lorries, he had tunnels. I mean, every type of transport you can think of was being used. So they were shipping the drugs over and shipping the cash back. Then he had another problem, which was if you open a Mexican bank account, it has to be in pesos.
So this was at Bittle Bank, wasn't it? Bittle? The HSBC.
Yeah. I think people pronounce it Betal, I think.
Betal.
Anyway, so Betal was the bank, and that was the bank that they bought. And they were warned. HSBC were explicitly warned by the Mexicans, by other people, but even by their own people, that this bank, which was the fifth biggest in Mexico, and no one had really ever heard of it. It was heavily concentrated in the drug region, which is in the north of the country towards the American border.
Yeah.
They were explicitly told this bank doesn't do compliance. And HSBC took this, dare I say it, rather arrogant British, almost imperialist attitude, because that was their background, of saying, well, you know, we'll bring our own standards and procedures to bear.
Yeah.
We'll sort it out. Well, of course they didn't. They, in their quest to be the biggest bank in the world, they promptly forgot about Mexico, left it to the Mexicans, and carried on buying other businesses across the world in order to be number one.
Yeah.
Chapo's problem was that the peso is not, it's all right in Mexico, but it's not an international currency.
And I was there when it was devalued. I was there on the day. You
can't rent a plane in Miami, charter a plane in Miami with pesos.
You'd need a whole hell of a lot of pesos.
No, but it's not going to happen. I mean, they wouldn't accept it.
Yeah.
So he wanted dollars, and HSBC, which had bought Bital, and let's be clear. I mean, Chapo himself was not walking into a bank and sitting down with a bank manager, and but what was happening was that across that region of Mexico, thousands of, and I mean thousands of small businesses were opening accounts, and they were giving all sorts of spurious details about themselves. I mean, I think as in the book, there's a woman who, she claimed that her income was $20,000, whatever it was. She grew melons and avocados in a backyard, and in a month she deposited $350,000 in cash.
Wow!
And
wow. That's quite a few avocados.
So bells should have gone off, and they didn't.
Yeah.
And these clients were, I'd really like to get into dollars. And HSBC said, oh, well, we've got a way around that. We can set up an account for you in the Cayman Islands at HSBC Mexico. All you do is pay it into Mexico, into your bank account here. We will transfer it to the Cayman Islands account. It's Cayman Islands branch. Well,
which is in dollars now. That's the key thing.
Which immediately goes into dollars, which then enables Chapo to buy his planes, his cars, educate his children at private schools, buy houses, and not just Chapo, but all his associates.
Yeah.
And the point I make in the book, which is, I think, the most shocking thing of all, really, or one of the many things, was that there never was a branch in Mexico, in the Cayman Islands. We all think of a bank branch as, having a cash machine, steps, a door, a lobby, tills, a tiled floor. That's the sort of feel we have for a bank. it's a solid building. There was no building called HSBC Mexico Cayman Islands. There never was.
No,
It was all entirely on desktop in Mexico City in the HSBC offices.
Yeah, so it's a fiction, an electronic fiction that
Yeah.
it's just what you call those particular accounts, which mean that they're situated outside of
Exactly,
Mexican or US law.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'd like to bring up is that it just as the banks, individual banks, when they do get done for money laundering, always say, well, it was just a few bad apples in the bank and, we'll get rid of them. Your story isn't that there's a globe of fine upstanding banks and HSBC just happened to go a bit off the rails. That I can't think of a major bank that hasn't at some point been done for money laundering. And on the Cayman thing, that kind of banking license, again, you make this clear in the book, that kind of banking license where you're allowed to say this is a Cayman bank, but there is no bank, the Class B license.
Yeah.
There's I think you said there's 149 Cayman bank licenses, and 136 of them are the Class B. So there's 136 banks around the world that are running this. We have a Cayman Island branch, so you can get into dollars.
And I would say as well that there's several things there. One is that it was exactly right. Second is the Cayman Islands, as I point out in the book, is it's not a rogue state. The Cayman Islands is protected by Britain. We look after the Cayman Islands. There's a government.
Well, of course we do. We have important banks there, Chris.
But the crazy thing is that our government ministers stand up in the House of Commons or at party conferences, and they've been doing this for the last, the last 30 years I can remember, saying now we're going to crack down on tax avoidance, blah, blah, blah. We're going to move against tax havens. Well, some of the leading tax havens of the world, offshore havens, are run by Britain. And whether it's Channel Islands, Gibraltar, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, they are all run effectively by Britain. We could close them down tomorrow if we wanted to, but we don't.
Oh, but that's because we then we'd be handing an unfair advantage to Luxembourg, Ireland.
Well, that brings me on to the next thing. The second thing is you rightly point out that what I say in the book about the Class B license, that is only the Caymans. All those places have similar structures. So there is an entire industry devoted to helping people hide their money, launder their money. I mean, no wonder we don't get anywhere. Because, as I say, there's an entire sector of people, professional services, who exist only to do this.
But that's the point, isn't it? That we confuse drug lords with money launderers, but the drug lords don't launder money. They are good at selling drugs and organizing import-export businesses. But the money launderers are people at the Rotary Club, people who dine at the House of Lords. They're the actual people who do the money laundering. I mean, El Chapo couldn't launder money if his life depended on it, because he doesn't.
We don't make the mental connection, so we are taught to think of drug lords as people who carry machine guns and murder people and do horrible things, and then we're also taught that banks are upright and proper, and the two don't connect. Well, they do connect. One is helping the other. And then my other point, I mean, you mentioned dining at the House of Lords and things, is that in my experience, having met many top business people, the thing that really bothers them more than anything, they make their money, they've made money, they've got their house in townhouse in London, they've got their house in the country, they've got their villa in the south of France, they've done all that, they've got all that. the thing that really bugs them and bothers them as they get older is their reputation.
Yeah.
And that comes down to personal, finding a banker. Finding a bank is about the same as finding a footballer a week's wages.
Yes, that's a very important point, is that
it has no impact at all. I mean, even the 1.8 billion, largest fine in American history, is written off as the cost of doing business.
That's part of the financial setup of the banks, really, isn't it? And a
exactly,
percentage of what they're making, they're sort of saying.
Exactly. And as I say in the book, it amounted to, if we all gasped at the size of the fine, it's 5 weeks profits.
Yeah. Yeah. I worked this out for another, I think it was the Wachovia case, that the fine they were given, I think I worked it out, it worked out as something like 1/2000th of the money they'd made from laundering the money. So that's not a fine. Surely that's more like the fiver that you press into the hand of the doorman on the nightclub you want to go to. Yeah, I mean, it's, exactly. That's not a fine. That's just tipping the doorman.
So the only thing that will bring bankers to their senses, stop them behaving in such a reckless manner, is the threat of jail. And the reason for that is that the threat of jail impacts on their personal freedom, and they can no longer have the best seats at the opera. They might not be invited to play golf. Yeah. Their wives will be whispered about at the school gate. All those things that are part of their world, and their nice, comfy living, they will be taken from them should they go to jail.
Yeah,
and their reputation will be trashed. But so far, that simply hasn't happened. No senior banker anywhere has been jailed from 2008. Take your pick.
Yeah.
There's been none.
And it's the same excuse used, the one where if you bring the bank down, if you go for a criminal prosecution and it loses its banking license, then the sky falls on everyone's head. That's what they always say.
So how can it be that, I think I'm right in saying that when the Americans wanted to move against HSBC was employing 330,000 people.
Yeah.
Now, let's say they wanted to prosecute 5 or 10. Well, that still leaves 330,000 people. And
good point, Chris.
The bank is going to carry on regardless.
Well, yes,
and in fact, it's an indictment of a bank the size of HSBC that, should some senior employees for some reason not be available, the whole bank apparently will collapse. Now, you can argue that yes, but the bank's reputation has been sullied and people don't want to be associated with it. I don't think people are that stupid.
No, that's not going to happen. That's absolute cobblers.
I mean, one of the jokes, by the way, and I've had this raised with me, so I may as well confess it now. People have said to me, "Assume you no longer bank at HSBC," and I've said, "Well, actually, I do," and they're horrified. And the reason for that, very simply, is trying to move a bank account is a nightmare. I can't be bothered.
Yeah. Well, I'm with you. I'm with you. I bought my house during the pandemic, and all the banks were not lending at the time. So I tried to go to any number of more upstanding banks, and they all said, "Sorry, we're not lending." So I ended up at HSBC.
Yeah,
just like you. Oh dear.
Yeah. So I mean, for all I know, I've got sort of red flags on my account, and be very careful. I doubt it. I don't think they care.
Well, honestly, if they didn't notice El Chapo, I mean, you're quite famous, Chris, but not that famous.
As a point out towards the end of the book, we just simply have not got it right. There is a sector of
but is it that we don't want to get it right, Chris? Because it's not just this bank. I mean, Deutsche Bank is been involved in any number of things,
Well, I think there's several things there. One is we are brought up to believe that banks are a pillar of our society, And if you start eroding that, then what have you got left? So that's one argument. Second argument is that inevitably these will be very complicated cases. And the truth is, juries do not understand this stuff. Why should they? And if you put numbers in front of people, their eyes start swimming.
Yeah.
And are you really going to set aside 6 months for a trial? If you're the state prosecutor, you can absolutely guarantee that against you will be the best, cleverest, most slippery lawyers that HSBC or anybody can buy.
Yeah.
And they will tie you in knots. And in the end, is it worth it? I would argue, yes, it is, because put all that on one side, and I do say this in the book, it does come down to a very simple thing, which is the difference between right and wrong.
Yeah.
And once you start making excuses as to why you can't prosecute people, why you can't move against the bank, then you're blurring the line.
Yeah.
And the point I make in the book is that, even at the end, HSBC were able to negotiate a settlement with the Americans. Well, I can't negotiate a settlement. If I leave my house, and go and hit somebody in the face, I will be charged with assault. There's no question of me having the ability to negotiate.
Yeah.
Why should these people have the ability to negotiate? And by the way, once you start negotiating, once you cross into the area of negotiation, then that's food and drink for a bank. That's what they do.
Yeah.
That's what they're experts at. They can negotiate their way out of anything.
Yeah. Well, let's also just look at how high up this went, because the people prosecuting assembling the prosecution weren't just a couple of gumshoes in America. You had the Office of the Control of the Currency, you had the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and as you say in the book, that's like being investigated by the Archangel Gabriel. It doesn't get. I can't think of a more frightening bunch of people with any more power than them. And if they, with the Department of Justice in America, can then be deflected, then what hope is there? And the fact that George Osborne then personally intervened, saying, "Oh gosh, we don't want you to prosecute our bank," and then you end up with just, what is it they call it, a deferred prosecution? Is that what they call it now?
Yeah, deferred prosecution agreement.
Which basically always just means, gosh, yes, we admit that money might have been laundered through the bank, but the bank didn't do it. We weren't aware. Sorry, we'll improve.
Well, it's a bit more than that. This is one of the things that no one really paid attention to, and I'm probably one of the few people who's bothered to read this thing. But the actual settlement, the admissions from HSBC, they run to 31 pages.
It's a lot of things to admit to.
They're admitting to an awful lot, and it's not the picture you have, the picture you're invited to have is, and I do make this comparison in the book, it's very similar to Apocalypse Now, where you've got a colonel, Marlon Brando's in the jungle in Vietnam and he's out of control. Well, that's really what happened, that Mexico was out of control. But one of the things that I didn't know until I started the research was that the Americans actually came to London and interviewed HSBC bosses at Canary Wharf. And this was for depositions for the grand jury. It went to grand jury. It was that close to being prosecuted. And I'd not appreciated that before.
Yes, and it then means you've got to get the Chancellor to write a letter saying, please don't do this. So it did get incredibly. I mean, the Americans were set to do it, weren't they?
Yes, they were, and the reason was that they got plenty of evidence. They'd had 3 separate strands of inquiry. They were really fed up. Their country was being flooded with drugs, still is, but was being flooded with drugs, principally from the Sinaloa cartel. And this was a way of breaking or attempting to break them. And the Americans were genuinely angry, as were the Mexicans. I mean, we all forget that the Mexican authorities, and they're very brave, by the way. I mean, they live in a country where, they are trying to do their best. I mean, we think, again, we are sort of taught or made to think that they're possibly corrupt. They're not really. They are very brave and they take huge risks. And they were fed up. They've been warning HSBC. The warnings have been ignored. And they started supplying evidence to the Americans.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. The Mexicans had been warning for a decade. It's not like just last Wednesday.
No, they've been warning consistently, and then within HSBC, because HSBC was such a hierarchical structure, warnings only went so far. They never, I mean, there are emails in the book or evidence where they did go to the top, but only towards the end.
Yeah, but at some point, people did know. I mean, the top people, the top HSBC people in Mexico, they knew.
Yeah.
And it had made its way through to HSBC. Yeah. I mean, Canary Wharf, I mean.
How the Mexicans came to resent the HSBC way, and how one of the bank supervisors is invited to dinner at someone's apartment, an HSBC executive's apartment, and he's telling him how wonderful it is. And the bank supervisor's thinking, I was only here a few months ago and someone else was living here. This is a service department. They don't learn the language, which they found insulting. They weren't there for very long. And then, towards the end, the number 2 in the bank, Michael Gagan, flies into Mexico on a sort of grand glad-handing tour. And at that point, he is met by 2 very senior bank supervisors and taken into a room and told what's been going on at his bank in Mexico. And that is really the first time it hits home. And the one thing that after that really did hit home to HSBC was the threat from the Americans to withdraw their banking charter, which would have meant they couldn't have banked in the United States.
Yeah.
And that suddenly, when they realized that was being discussed, they suddenly jumped into action.
But I mean, again, it's something that you deal with in the book, and I think it's important to bring out, is that when we say the bank might not have been aware, there are whole legislations that are in place to make sure that banks should be aware. You have risk officers and you have compliance officers. And it was an amazing statistic in the book where you said, look, 2007, HSBC had 16,500 employees, of which 198 were in compliance. And some of those had been outsourced to India. So those are the people who are supposed to be checking the accounts to make sure that no money laundering has gone on. 198 out of 16,500. I mean, come on.
It's the classic thing. We wait for the day when the head of compliance becomes the head of the bank.
Good luck with that.
It's never going to happen. I mean, compliance is regarded pretty much on the same level as the referee on the football pitch.
I think you're being generous there, actually.
They're there to get in the way and stop the action. And they don't earn the big money. They're not the people doing the deals. They are they're a nuisance. But the banks will say, no, they're not. We take them very seriously. But you only have to look at the numbers. And they even, I think there's one person in the book where she is on a fast track, and she's got this whole brief of different jobs, one of which is compliance, and it's an afterthought. I mean, ideally, they don't want compliance at all. They'd rather there wasn't any.
Yeah,
and it's wrong. They should be made. And then the other thing, which I think I highlight in the book, is that when you talk to the bank, and any bank, by the way, it doesn't matter if it's HSBC or any bank, they will tell you how. They always tell journalists and people like me how brilliant they are. I mean, they will not hold back in telling you how fantastically successful they are, how much better they are than any other bank.
Like you, I've met them. Yeah, I've had dinner with them.
How much better they are than their clients. They have very grand buildings. That's in the book. They specialize in having fantastic atriums. Fantastic. I mean, some of the best meals I've ever had have been with executives in the hospitality suites of banks.
Yeah, me too in Ireland. Yes.
I mean, quite extraordinary. And you think, well, first of all, you think, who's paying for all this? But I've never really been able to get my head around why they think that they need to behave like this, but they do behave like that. Yeah. And they lay it on thick. So they're busy telling you how fantastically brilliant they are. I remember it was not HSBC, but I remember going to Lehman just before it went under, and we sat at the top of their building in Canary Wharf. I had a lunch with the top people in London. It was honestly silver service. The meal was as good as anything you'd get, say, in Gavroche or a restaurant like that. The wine was out of this world. And in the lift on the way down, I remember they had these signs saying, "Welcome our new intake." And then there was this list of who they were. And there was something like 5 Olympic gold medalists, wow. six. I mean, there's this list of honors they'd all won. Mm. And like they really believe they're super, masters of the universe. Yeah. That's what they believe.
Yeah.
And it was only probably 3 or 4 weeks after that the bank went down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing is, banks are supposed to report suspicious activity reports, SARs, and I think HSBC, from the book, I think they'd let something like 17,000 of these things just accumulate in a big dusty drawer and not done anything with them.
Yeah.
So what's the point? You've got no compliance officers. You're not bothering to actually action any of the suspicious activity reports. And in 2004, you decide, I know what we'll do. We'll move our US headquarters to the state of Delaware, which is more secretive than Switzerland. Well, that sort of suggest that there is, it's because it's easy to say it's all oversight and they were too busy, but not actioning parts of the law, like the suspicious activity reports, and deciding to move your headquarters to a much more secretive location. Those are things done on purpose.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no question. And in fact, when they realized that they got all these SARs, they're called, all these transactions that nobody had looked at, their solution was actually, even then, the classic one of arrogance, which was to literally go into the market and hire, I can't remember the number now, but it's in the book, so many hundred people to go through them and look at them. And all they did was throw quantity at the problem. They thought, we'll hire loads of people, they'll go through it. They were paid, they were paid by how many transactions they'd looked at in an hour. not how many they found that were suspicious. And one of the things that happened is that there's this whistleblower comes forward, somebody who tried to join the CIA, couldn't get in, applied.
You're
to
talking
join
about Everett Stern.
Everett Stern, yeah. And Everett Stern, is on the side of right. He wanted to serve his country. He couldn't. Anyway, he joined the bank, and in the anti-money laundering department, in Delaware, and was really shocked by what he saw, because every time he raised a suspicious transaction with his supervisor, effectively the supervisor was wishing he hadn't.
Yeah.
It was an inconvenience. I'd rather you didn't, because we're getting paid by the every time you call a halt because you found something, means we're not getting through it quick enough. Yeah. So he then goes back to the CIA and says, I've got something to tell you. And that was one of the things where the Americans knew they were on very strong ground, because they had investigators, but they also had a whistleblower.
Well, I mean, the whistleblower is a separate issue. I mean, probably later, in a day or two, we're going to talk to Jonathan Sugarman, who is a banking whistleblower. And the thing is, they're treated, as Everett was in your book, as criminals because they've divulged.
They've done their job, though.
Well, no, their job is to not divulge the secrets of the bank. And when they do, I mean, why do we even have a word whistleblower? That's like, if I saw someone being mugged and told the police, does that make me a whistleblower?
Yeah, I mean, I started working in the city a long time ago. So a very long time ago. But you were taught on no account, that all your values are thrown up in the air. It's your firm first, family and friends second. You snitch, and it's almost a male. Is it male? Do women have the same issues? I think they probably do, but certainly at boys, you're taught very early on. We don't like snitches. We don't like the one who's the grass. We don't like the one who's blowing the whistle. Yeah. And if you blow the whistle, okay, you get your moments in the sun, but you will be ostracized. You will not get a job. You will not get a job in the City of London or Wall Street ever again.
Yeah, I don't know a single whistleblower story that ends happily, and I've talked to a lot of them.
No. I can't think of any, and I've met a few. I've met the people who did Enron and all sorts of things down the years, and they've taken a conscious decision because they're quite right. Found something wrong, but society doesn't really. They're not rewarded for that.
Yeah, I mean,
in fact, they're punished.
Just a last thought, which is again going back to this notion that this isn't something peculiar to HSBC, and a link to the financial crash, because of course one of the things that all the banks wanted after 2008 was cash, was fungible assets, as they say, and I couldn't help but think that obviously then anyone who's laundering drug money is going to weather the financial crash better than other people, because you got billions of cash coming in. And I then looked at the two Spanish enclaves in North Africa, Ceuta and Melilla or something. I always get the names wrong. And they're little tiny dusty enclaves, and everyone who lives there is dirt poor. But when I looked, both of them are absolutely stuffed with big banks, most of the Spanish banks, offering high net worth individual private services. And I thought, well, that's not being offered to the local goat herders, but it is the major drug route coming out of South America.
That's exactly right. The banks want cash. It was easy money. There's a section in the book where, when they first went into Mexico, people in the bank were a bit skeptical, not just about the bank they were buying, but about Mexico itself. They ignored all the warnings, not just warnings about the bank, but also warnings about the country. You know, the fact that drug cartels are endemic. It's a terrible problem for the Mexicans and Mexican authority. But lo and behold, within a couple of years of going into Mexico, they're announcing to a rapturous audience at the AGM, the annual general meeting, that the profits from revenues from Mexico have gone through the $1 billion barrier. And then you think, well, of course, no one in the hall stopped to say, excuse me, how did that happen?
Well, Chris, it was those avocados and melons. Come on.
Exactly. But how does it happen that a country that is not really, let's face it, one of the, I mean, this economy is a lot healthier now than it was, but at that time it wasn't. How's it suddenly producing those sorts of revenues for us? And they, instead of thinking we need to find out, they just carried on. And
surely they thought to themselves, we must not find out.
Yeah, I'm probably being slightly, it's odd for me to say, I'm probably being a bit more generous. I think you're probably nearer the truth. But because, I mean, you know, you couldn't ignore the figures. I mean, one of the things that the Americans threw at them was that they were dealing in cash dollars. And we really are talking dollar bills here. Yeah. They were dealing in more cash dollars than the whole of all the other banks in Latin America combined.
Wow.
Much more. I mean, huge amounts. So they were taking them by truck. So the dollars come in, are paid into Mexico. And as I say in the book, Chapo had special pouches made that fitted under the teller's window. So the whole transaction could be over in a matter of seconds. They're depositing so much cash.
You said in the book it's about $900,000 in a day.
The dollars were taken back to the States, but they were having to hire armored cars, outriders, and going into the taking the money back to HSBC in the United States.
Yeah,
there's no way on earth that HSBC didn't know that. They were warned. The sheer volume of business that was going, and as you say, from melon. I mean, the melon and avocado grower, the one who said she only earned $20,000 a year, if it was, and her money, her account was one of the accounts used to buy an aircraft. And Chapo had 13 of them.
We're on the wrong business.
We are.
Well, I'm afraid you do think that. I mean, they have fairly barbaric marketing techniques, though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all very well me saying in the city of London and Wall Street, you're taught very early on not to blow the whistle. The Mexicans have a way of teaching you as well. Yeah. It's not very pleasant.
It usually involves quite radical surgery without anaesthetic.
Yeah.
Listen, Chris, it's been fantastic talking to you. Are you doing any more research along these lines?
No, my next book, which I'm finishing now, is The World's Biggest Cash Machine.
That's about the Glazers.
It's about the Glazers and how the Glazers destroyed the soul of the beautiful, about the Glazers and Manchester United.
Yeah.
No, well, Ian will want you back on the show for that one. I can see the tear in his eye from here.
Happily come on and talk about it.
That would be brilliant, Chris.
Listen, Chris, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks. Bye.
Wow, that was amazing.
Well, our thanks to Chris Blackhurst and talking to us about his book, Too Big to Jail. So anyone who thought that money laundering was a small problem, buy yourself a copy of a book and prepare to be horrified.
Yes. That was he was really interesting.
He was, and forthright, and knew what he was talking about. I mean, like I said, I thought I knew a lot about that story, and then I realised I didn't know anything.
There was a little bit more.
And if you did like that, look out for the interview we did with Jonathan Sugarman about whistleblowing in general. So a very good story.
And we've got other stories like AI, COVID, bird flu, and energy. So if you like that, follow us, like it.
Leave us a review. And if you'd like to leave a comment, we've set up on Substack a Hyperland Substack. Go to Substack, look up Hyperland, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you thought. And if you've got any ideas you'd like us to cover, that'd be great too. Thanks very much.